Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Matt Abbott, and I'm the Director of Government and Diplomatic Programs at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. I am delighted to welcome Anders Fogh Rasmussen to Chicago. We are honored to host him here at the Council. A few notes on housekeeping. For your information, this program is on the record. Please feel free to use social media. This event is also being live streamed, and please remember to silence your phones. We have some upcoming programs in the coming days at the Council that may be of interest to you. Tomorrow, Martin Lusteau, the Ambassador of Argentina to the United States, will join us for lunch in the inaugural event for our Growth Market series. On October 20th, an expert panel will join us for a look at the future of North Korea. And on October 24th, we will be hosting a half-day symposium on the rise of populism with a number of speakers, including the head of Chatham House, Robin Niblett, policy experts, professors, and journalists. The Council on Global Affairs is an independent, nonpartisan organization that convenes leading global voices, conducts independent research, and engages the public to provide insight and influence the discourse on critical global issues. For nearly a century, the Council has provided a platform for a variety of different voices to promote deeper global understanding and active U.S. engagement in the world. The views of individuals expressed on these platforms, including our website, are their own, and they do not represent the institutional positions or views of the Council on Global Affairs, its members, or its supporters. Turning back to this evening's program, Michael Werner will formally introduce our speaker. Mr. Werner is the former Chief Executive Officer of Globe Union Group. He also serves on the Council's Board of Directors. I will then moderate the question and answer session after our speaker's remarks. And please remember, our local bookseller, the bookseller, will have copies of Mr. Rasmussen's book, The Will to Lead, America's Indispensable Role in the Global Fight for Freedom, for purchase and signing after the event. Thank you very much.
I like the name of the bookseller. Very well done. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Chicago Council of Global Affairs, it's my pleasure to welcome His Excellency Anders Fogh Rasmussen to the Council. He will be discussing the future of America's role in the world, a topic that is particularly relevant at this point in time with the election. Throughout President Obama's time in office, the mantra which has characterized the administration's foreign policy, leading from behind, has been heavily scrutinized. U.S. involvement in complex situations over the past few years, whether it be the nuclear deal with Iran, Russia's actions in Ukraine, the war in Syria, and the actions in Libya, have shaped discussions on what Americans' foreign policy should be. Some have pushed for increased intervention, while others have argued for less involvement. Our speaker certainly has strong opinions on this topic, and we're looking forward to hearing more from him on this tonight. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce our guest. Anders Fogh Rasmussen has been at the center of European and global politics for 3 decades as Secretary General of NATO, Prime Minister of Denmark, Danish Minister of Economic Affairs, and a leading Danish parliamentarian. He grew up on a farm, and although he's an avid cyclist, hiker, and kayaker, as a child he mostly played a game with his siblings that they called politics. And can anyone guess what his favorite role was? Prime Minister. He became active in politics while a student in reaction to the Marxist protest throughout much of Europe in the late 1960s, and was elected to Parliament at the young age of 25 after finishing his master's degree in economics. During the 1980s, he played a key role in Danish economic and foreign policy and was active in the negotiations that ultimately led to the creation of the euro currency. He became Prime Minister in 2001 after leading his center-right party to its first victory over the Socialist Democrats in many years, and he was considered a great representation of the new breed of conservatives. Prime Minister Rasmussen hoped to reduce Denmark's large social welfare bureaucracy without eliminating the basic protections that it offered, while also limiting immigration and concessions to far-right nationalists. His strong interest in both economics and global affairs made him an ideal candidate to lead the accession negotiations of 10 new members to the EU during the Danish presidency of the EU. Later, as Secretary General of NATO, he developed a new strategic concept that he called smart defense that included enhanced readiness, efficiency, and new partnerships. He's written for many publications and delivered speeches around the world on international leadership and geopolitical issues. After listening to him tonight, you'll not be surprised to learn that his hero was President Harry Truman, and his favorite quote is from Winston Churchill. A pessimist sees the difficulty in every opportunity. An optimist sees the opportunity in every difficulty. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming His Excellency to the Council of Global Affairs, Prime Minister Rasmussen.
Thank you very much, Michael Werner, for that very kind and very generous introduction. It is indeed a great pleasure for me to be back in Chicago and here in Chicago Council. I visited Chicago on numerous occasions. I have spoken in Chicago Council several times, and each and every time has been a very great pleasure for me. I regret, of course, that Ivo couldn't join us tonight. He is traveling. I'm pleased that Elisa is here. Maybe you can report to Ivo what I have to say tonight. Otherwise, he will be able to watch the live stream, because I think my theme tonight will be very much in line with Ivo's thinking, as he and I have discussed these issues on numerous occasions. Actually, Ivo was one of my sparring partners during the preparation for this book. So no doubt that he would appreciate what I have to say tonight. I told you that I've been here on numerous occasions. Of course, one of the highlights was the NATO summit in 2012. I still remember the hospitality of your city and the well-prepared, effectively conducted summit, where we also took very important political decisions. As some of you also know, I have a very personal relationship to the state of Illinois since my family lives in Springfield. My son, or our son, and our daughter-in-law and 3 grandchildren are living in Springfield. So obviously I will also often pass by Chicago on my way to Springfield. And this very personal transatlantic relationship is also one of the reasons why I wrote the book, The Will to Lead. Because I love America, I'm a friend of America, and I have an appeal to the American people just before you will go to elect the next president. And my clear message is the following: the world needs a policeman, and the only capable, reliable, and desirable candidate for that post is the United States. So what we do need is determined American global leadership. And I hope the next president of the United States will exercise such leadership. Maybe I should expand a bit on that clear message. And I would take my point of departure in the fact that the world is on fire. Wherever you look, you see wars, you see terrorism, upheavals, instability. In the Middle East, you see Syria torn up by war. Iraq is fighting with terrorism. You see a Europe almost sinking under the burden from refugees coming from Syria. In North Africa, we have Libya, which today is a failed state and a breeding ground for terrorists. In Eastern Europe, you see Russia in a still more assertive role, attacking Ukraine. China is flexing its muscles in the South China Sea, and the rogue state North Korea is threatening not only its neighbors, but also the United States with a nuclear attack. And I also have to say, bluntly, I see a clear link between the American reluctance to use force and the outbreak of this fire. We know from history that when the United States retreats, or even is perceived to retreat, the United States will leave behind a security vacuum, and that vacuum will be filled by the bad guys. And that's exactly what we are seeing now. So a US withdrawal from world affairs will lead to stronger foes, weaker friends, and a more insecure world. So I'm tempted to quote the old philosopher Edmund Burke, who once said, "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing." Well, as I indicated, I love America. I am what I would call a classical European liberal who has always counted on American leadership. You were there whenever it was needed. During the Second World War, you came to Europe, you liberated Europe from the scourge of Nazism. I was born and raised in Denmark, a small European country, which has continually upheld strong ties with America. My father profited greatly from the Marshall Plan that was launched by President Truman. I still remember how my parents were encouraged by President Kennedy's inspiring communication. And I myself, as a very young parliamentarian, visited the United States for the first time in 1982. And I admit, after 6 years at university, I arrived a bit skeptical when I landed in Washington, 4th of July, 1982. That was the Reagan years. But I returned home with, I would say, uplifted mind, having experienced what I would call the infectious optimism that President Reagan had initiated. By the way, one of my visits during my travel to the United States in the summer 1982 was Chicago. And I visited the University of Chicago, where I met Professor Lucas, who later, as you know, received the Nobel Prize in economics. That was really, I would say an awakening. You speak about a spiritual awakening, but here it was an economic awakening. At the university, I was taught what we call demand economics, which is Keynesian economics. But Professor Lucas, he introduced me to another theory called supply-side economics. So he taught me how you could make your economic, your national, your macroeconomics at home more dynamic through profound reforms on the supply side of your economy. And that was exactly what President Reagan did. He met a lot of resistance. Many Europeans ridiculed him. But he succeeded, among other things, because he had a firm conviction that capitalism and classical liberalism were superior to communism. So based on that firm conviction, he won the Cold War, I would say. The Soviet Union collapsed and a new era could start. So that's why in my book I highlight these three presidents. Truman, who created the world order we have profited from since then. President Kennedy, who at the height of the Cold War infused some optimism in all of us due to his inspiring communication, and President Reagan, who, thanks to his firm conviction, really put an end peacefully to the Cold War. Now, as Prime Minister of Denmark, I worked closely with President Bush. I supported the military operation in Afghanistan, in Iraq. I supported strongly his freedom agenda. And I have also worked closely with his successor, President Obama. I supported a NATO operation in Libya, 2011. I supported the strengthening of NATO's territorial defense after President Putin's aggression against Ukraine. We worked together to carry out deep reforms of NATO, so the NATO structure became leaner and meaner. So you will see that for me, this is a long-standing belief that the United States represents the positive values, actually, that the United States is a force for good in the world. And for me, it's not a question about a Republican or a Democrat in the White House. I work closely with both kinds of presidents. I have got a lot of inspiration from both Republicans and Democrats. For me, it's a question of the election of a president who has the will to lead. Now, actually, it's more difficult to sell this message to the Americans than I had expected. And you could ask me, why is it that we, the Americans, should bear this burden, pay these taxes to be the world's policeman? There are many reasons. First of all, you could ask, who else? Who else could do it? The UN? No. The UN is too weak, too ineffective. Russia? No. Russia is a declining society, assertive against its neighbors, so Russia has provoked a global distrust. Could China serve as a global policeman? No. I mean, a communist state would never gain the global trust that is needed. And actually, China, of course, is a rising society, but still it doesn't have the global reach. If you have a look at America, it's quite different. The US is a benign democracy, characterized by the diversity and the global networks that are a result of America's attractiveness. You attract the most talented people from all over the world, and due to that fact, you have also a widespread connection with all parts of the world. So we can trust the United States. I wouldn't suggest that America never makes mistakes. Of course you do, and I'm tempted to quote Churchill, who once said that the Americans will eventually do the right thing after having tried everything else. And sometimes you feel there is a truth in that. I also have to say, to be the world's policeman is an awful and thankless job, but someone has to do it, and the United States is the only one that can do it. Only the United States has the diplomatic, military, and economic power to get things done. And I know from my own experience as Secretary General of NATO, not least, that when the United States doubt, when the United States holds back, when the United States is undecided, then the world has no leadership, there is no direction, and there is no action. Then the question, of course, is how can we convince the Smith family in Peoria that you should spend the resources necessary to be the world's policeman? How can the Smith family in Peoria buy the argument? I would point to three elements. Firstly, if the United States does not go out into the world to nip the evil at the root, the evil may strike the United States. That's exactly what we saw 9/11. So it is in the United States' self-interest to actually go abroad, go overseas, strike the enemy on his soil instead of having the enemy striking you on your soil. The second argument is that prevention is better and less expensive than cure or treatment, also when we're speaking about security policy, because it is more effective for the United States, it's less expensive for the United States to prevent the conflicts or to knock down the conflicts while they're still small, instead of sitting idly by on the fence and see them grow bigger and bigger, and at last they are unmanageable. That's exactly what we saw in the 30s. And that led to the Second World War. In the 30s, you had a strong isolationist movement in this country, and it led to a global disaster because the United States didn't show global leadership. And finally, I would say it's also in America's self-interest to uphold the global world order that President Truman created after the Second World War. He created a framework of institutions like, of course, the United Nations, but also the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the International Trade Organization, and he created a set of rules that we have followed ever since. And the framework President Truman created has generated an unprecedented era of peace and prosperity. It's a fact that the United States prospers when the world is at peace and rules are respected. So, for these reasons, I think the United States has a clear self-interest in being the world's policeman. Now, of course, you shouldn't be alone. You should have assistance in conducting this work as the world's policeman, a vice sheriff or whatever we might call it. And I think the Europeans should do more to help the United States. We have a lot of common interests across the Atlantic. When it comes to economy, 40% of the global GDP is produced by North America and Europe. And we represent 50% of all global trade. So obviously, when it comes to economy, we have strong mutual interests. But also when it comes to security. That's why President Truman established NATO in 1949. And since then, NATO has been the bedrock of North Atlantic security. And I would say NATO is the best security deal the United States has ever made, because within NATO, you have a standing capacity, you have a standing command structure, you have standing structures that can be initiated quickly if needed. And the lesson you learned the hard way during the Second World War is it is dangerous for America when the eastern shore of the Atlantic is dominated by a hostile power in Europe. And I can tell you, if the United States were to withdraw from Europe, President Putin would advance. Maybe he wouldn't occupy individual states, at large at least, but the Russian influence or maybe dominance would, for the United States, create a very dangerous situation, and it wouldn't be in the United States' interest to see Russia dominate Europe. I have no doubt that an American withdrawal from Europe would mean more Russian influence in Europe, and that would eventually create a more hostile Europe. So it is in America's self-interest to uphold and develop the economic and security relations across the Atlantic. I would favor the development of what I call an integrated transatlantic community. And that transatlantic community would comprise three elements. Firstly, security. We should strengthen our security cooperation. And first and foremost, of course, the Europeans should live up to the requirements within NATO. That is, they should invest at least 2% of GDP in defense. The good news is that we decided to do so at the NATO summit in September 2014. All 28 allies subscribed to the pledge that within the next decade they would reach the 2% benchmark. Of course, at the end of the day, it's not only a question of money. You should also develop the military capability so that you can participate in all kinds of operations. But still, it is a very important goal to reach the 2% benchmark. Today, only 5 out of 28 allies fulfill the 2% benchmark. So let's work in that direction. Let's strengthen the security cooperation. The second strand of work should be to create what I call an economic NATO. We have the security NATO. We should also create an economic NATO. And actually, you do have provisions in the current NATO treaty for the development of a strengthened economic cooperation. We don't discuss it that often, but in Article 2, we have stated that it's our intention to eliminate conflicts in our economic policies, and we will encourage economic collaboration between any or all of the allies. So here you have an article that could provide the basis for strengthened economic cooperation across the Atlantic. In my opinion, we should strive for a transatlantic free trade area, TAFTA. Today, I know it's dangerous to use such words, but I think TAFTA should be the long-term goal. But the very first step in that direction could be to finalize negotiations on the TTIP. It's a transatlantic trade and investment partnership as soon as possible. As soon as possible. Unfortunately, both presidential candidates have expressed skepticism concerning new trade agreements. But I tell you, I am a 100% free trader. I do believe that free trade across borders not only creates peace, but also prosperity. And to quickly finalize the TTIP would also strengthen economic bonds across the Atlantic. So that should be the second element. And the third element in this integrated transatlantic community should be to strengthen the people-to-people contacts. I told you that I profited greatly from participating in the State Department International Visitor Leadership Program in 1982. And I think we should expand on that. Not only that politicians can visit each other in America and in Europe, but also that students, academics, artists should have the same possibility. Well, I do know that we have such possibilities, but these programs should be greatly expanded. And you shouldn't underestimate the value of leaders from all walks of life meeting more frequently. We know from Europe what it means. In Brussels, we have the EU headquarters. And within the EU, national leaders from all walks of life meet on very frequently in Brussels. And when you meet, you discuss things, you exchange information and views, and all that contribute to a strengthening of bonds. And we need to strengthen these people-to-people bonds across the Atlantic. And that's why I would favor an expansion of these exchange programs. Now, of course, we shouldn't be inward-looking. A strengthened transatlantic community should have a global perspective. That's why in my book I argue that the world's democracies should unite in an alliance for democracy, which should count not only NATO countries, but also like-minded democracies like Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, India, and other democracies. Also because we live in an era where autocracies are more aggressive than they used to be. After the end of the Cold War, we believed that our system, our liberal democratic system based on capitalism, was so superior that all countries in the world would adopt that. They didn't. And according to the American institution Freedom House, freedom and democracy in the world is receding, are receding. For the 10th consecutive year, we have also in 2016 seen how freedom and democracy are receding. So to counter autocracies, we need this alliance for democracy. I know that the message, my appeal to the American people to be a stronger global leader can seem to be hard, perhaps unfair, but it is a fact that autocrats and terrorists are tempted to test their room for maneuver and test the determination of the free world, and in particular the United States, if they sense that they can conduct their illegal and heinous acts without serious consequences. When the United States steps forwards, we can enjoy peace and stability. When the United States steps back, we will experience conflict and chaos. In many ways, I agree that the United States is an exceptional nation, the shining city on the hill that attracts people from all over the world. But you should also realize that with that exceptionalism also comes exceptional obligations and exceptional responsibilities to protect and promote the principles upon which our free societies are built: individual liberty, democracy, and the rule of law. So it isn't sufficient for the United States to be a gatekeeper. You should be the world's policeman. Whether you like it or not, you are destined to lead. Superpowers don't get to retire. As Jefferson once said, the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. And that's exactly why we need determined American global leadership. Thank you.
Your Excellency, thank you very much for your remarks. Before we turn to audience questions, we'd like to show a short video clip. In the past few weeks, the Council has been engaged with interviewing ordinary Americans on the street, people like the Smith family in Peoria that you mentioned in your remarks, to get their views on American leadership and international affairs. After viewing this short video clip, Your Excellency, I'd be interested in your thoughts on Americans who do believe that America must lead abroad. What can those ordinary Americans be doing to engage with their government and to promote that American leadership abroad? So we'll turn to that video clip now.
I think America's role in the world should be as a role model. We had a period where America really took right after World War II and the creation of Bretton Woods. We had a clear leadership of, not only would this be a beneficial for America, but this would be beneficial for the other surrounding countries in order to build each other up globally, not just build themselves up globally. America should retake that role just in a new way that is relevant to these times.
And your thoughts, please.
Actually, I fully agree that an integrated part of demonstrating this global leadership is also to be a role model, which means that, of course, it is a prerequisite for ensuring the legitimacy of global leadership that you live up to your own standards. So the American society should, of course, also be critical against torture or lack of upholding the rule of law or whatever it might be. I have discussed these issues with both President Bush and President Obama. It's essential, of course, that all those principles you tend to preach towards the world are upheld in your own country. So what could the American people do? Yeah, first of all, I think you should elect a president who will exercise such global leadership. In very concrete terms, I think the next president should, as his or her first act in the inaugural address in January, he or she should say exactly the same with his or her own words, but as President Kennedy did in January 1961 when he said, "We Americans," he said, "we are prepared to pay any price, bear any burden, to defend our friends, oppose our foes, and protect liberty." It's the strongest commitment to American leadership I've ever heard. I would like the next president to say that, exactly that, in the inaugural address. Soon after, he or she should convene the congressional leaders to achieve a bipartisan support for the main lines in American foreign policy, because it is weakening the US abroad when you pursue partisan foreign and defense policy at home. And within the first 100 days, he or she should convene the world's democratic leaders to prepare the ground for what I call an alliance for democracy. That's exactly what I think should be done.
Thank you very much. We have time for questions from the audience now. If you have a question, please raise your arm. A member of our staff will bring a microphone to you after I've acknowledged you. And please make sure that your question is a question and not a statement. Yes, sir, on the side.
Hello. You argue that the U.S. should be the globe's, that being the world's policeman would be in our own self-interest. How do you reconcile that with the common understanding of police as public servants not acting in their own interest, but in deference to a law that's consented to by the governed?
Could you elaborate a bit on that? I don't
So
quite
it strikes me, you know, police are not supposed to be the largest business on the block who has the capacity to, you know, sort of dictate terms to other people, but instead be objective public servants. How can you trust the U.S. to be acting the public good while making the argument that it's in our own best interest to take on that burden?
Yeah.
How do you differentiate the two?
Yeah. I think that on the global stage, you need a stronger policeman than you may need in local communities. For instance, to counter President Putin's aggressive behavior, you really need a strong, I think you need a strong military force. You also need, in addition to that, the will to use it if necessary. Because I do believe that the best way to prevent conflicts is to deter potential aggressors from even thinking about attacking you or your friends. And to that end, you need to be very strong. So that's why, actually, that's why President Reagan succeeded in forcing the Soviet Union to, so to speak, surrender, because he negotiated from a position of strength. And that's exactly what I think is needed. All this starts with strength at home, But of course, you could ask the question, yeah, but how can we make sure that the United States not just pursues its own interests? Well, I tried to answer that question already in my introduction by asking the question, who else would you trust than the United States? I'm not scared about the perspective of the US pursuing its own interests because it's a democracy. And that makes a difference, in my opinion. So, in short, I think the United States should be strong militarily, and we shouldn't be scared by the fact that the United States pursues interests that are in full accordance with free democracies.
Next question. Yes, sir, in the second row, please.
The implications of your remarks, I think, are that the U.S. may not be doing such a good job in exerting global leadership. Where would you fault what we have done in recent times? It seems like we've done a lot. We're fighting 2 wars. We've got a trade agreement in Asia. We've taken the Iranian nuclear program off the table. Where would you fault what we're doing?
Where would I? Yeah. If you look at all the examples where we have intervened in recent years, then you could easily point to unsuccessful conclusions. For instance, in Afghanistan, we are now seeing the Taliban return. In certain areas, they have taken over the control of local institutions. So you could point to that as an example of a failure. In Iraq, you have seen how marginalized Sunni elements have joined Islamic State. Could that also be used as an example of a failure? In Libya, you have a failed state. We conducted a very successful military operation, but now Libya is a failed state. So shouldn't we be more modest? Very often I meet that question. But my point is the following. As well as you can point to failures when we take action, and of course action has a cost, then if you have a look at examples where we didn't take action, the costs are even higher. I could mention just 3 examples. The Balkans in the 90s, at the beginning of the dissolution of the former Yugoslavia, you saw civil wars in the former Yugoslav territory, which killed 100,000 people, and more than 1 million were displaced. It wasn't until the Srebrenica massacre that the United States decided to take action, and successfully so. Today we have peace in Bosnia and Kosovo. The Balkans is, at large, a success, because we took action eventually. But at the beginning we didn't, and it was a disaster. Take the genocide in Rwanda as another example. 1 million people killed in that genocide, more than you can think of today. President Clinton himself has said he considered it a failure that his administration didn't act at that time. And of course, Syria is the current tragic example of the costs of inaction. 300,000 people killed, more than 10 million people displaced out of a total population of 22 million. So it's a human tragedy. So you can point to costs of action, but I would argue that the costs of inaction are much, much higher. So what we should do is to learn the lessons from the failures, not to conclude that isolationism is the right way forward, but to conclude that now and then we must use force or threaten to use force, but of course, any military operation should be accompanied by a well-thought-through political strategy for how to handle the post-conflict situation. So that would be my conclusion, that we should start training and education of local security forces much earlier than we did in Afghanistan. In Iraq, the problem wasn't the invasion in 2003. The problem was, or started, when the United States withdrew in 2011, and then Prime Minister Maliki pursued very sectarian policies, marginalized the Sunnis who joined what eventually became Islamic State. And in Libya, we learned the lesson that once you start a military operation, you should also prepare a plan for how to handle it once the military leaves, as we did on the 31st of October 2011. But on the 1st November, no one was there to help the new authorities build a new society from scratch. So that would be my conclusion, that we prepare such operations better. My conclusion is not that we should be isolationists.
Next question. Yes, sir. Second row.
Hi, I had a question. You made a really great point that if America is to be the world's policeman, Europeans should contribute more to assist America in doing that. However, from my position, it seems like Europeans would probably be very happy to, use their tax revenues to support their welfare states and have American taxpayers bear the burden. So how do you make a better case to Europe that they should be contributing more and not just having American taxpayers on the hook? Thank you.
Yeah, but that's a very good point. And it is, of course, a challenge. I take responsibility also because I was a prime minister in a country. We spend, I think, 1.4% or so of our GDP on defense. But part of my answer to you is that President Putin, in that respect, is a great asset because he has made very clear to all the Europeans why they need NATO and why they need to invest more. We were all very quick to harvest the peace dividend after the end of the Cold War. And of course, it was, in a way, it was natural. We had spent a lot of money during the Cold War to uphold large militaries to keep the communists at bay. Once the Soviet Union collapsed and you saw a new, and it seemed to be a new democratic Russia, then we started to consider Russia a partner. And of course you could then reduce your defense investments, and we did. The new situation is that after the Russian attack on Ukraine in February 2014, it's clear Russia is not a strategic partner, Russia is a strategic challenge. And that's why the Europeans must invest more in defense, and they will. I can tell you that in 2016, the Europeans invest much more in defense than they did in the previous years. So it's my assessment that 2015 will represent the lowest level of defense investments. From here, you will move towards the 2% target, which of course, it will be challenging. It will be a slow process, but I have no doubt we will work in that direction. So what I can't manage, I think Putin can.
Next question. Yes, in the back, the woman in blue, please, on the side.
Hi, just following up on what you were talking about with the role of Russia and NATO, I was wondering if you could comment on Mearsheimer's realist perspective or interpretation that the expansion of NATO was a direct cause of Russian aggression in the Middle East and Eastern Europe. Thanks.
Yeah, it's a good question, which often is raised. I don't think the Russian propaganda is justified on that point. We have done a lot to reach out to the Russians throughout this process. If you have a look at NATO enlargements towards the east, the Russians claim that in 1990, when we negotiated the reunification of Germany, they got a promise that NATO wouldn't expand towards the east. They have never got such a pledge from NATO side. And the good thing is that all the documents from those negotiations were declassified recently. So now you are able to read yourself, to can see what was said and what wasn't said. And this issue wasn't even discussed for a very good reason, namely, the Warsaw Pact still existed at that time in 1990. It wasn't dissolved until the year after in 91. So no one considered an enlargement of NATO. What was discussed and negotiated was only the reunification of Germany. And actually, it's interesting to note that the reason why Russia at that time accepted the much bigger, the reunified Germany, they accepted the reunification because Germany became a member of NATO. So the Russians knew that now it wouldn't be a nationalistic Germany, but a Germany bound into a multilateral framework, namely NATO. On top of that, first President Yeltsin and since also President Putin indicated an interest in becoming members of NATO. Russia indicated interest in becoming a member of NATO. Now, they never applied for it. It was never realistically discussed, but we have public statements from Putin that one could consider a future Russian membership of NATO. All that just to stress that at that time, the Russians didn't consider NATO a threat. And of course, NATO has never been a threat to Russia. And we have demonstrated that on several occasions. Before the first enlargement of NATO in 1999, we adopted a joint NATO-Russian document called the NATO-Russia Founding Act in 1997. Among other initiatives, we allowed the Russians to establish an embassy, a permanent representation in the midst of NATO headquarters in Brussels, as a confidence-building measure. The next big enlargement of NATO took place in 2004. Again, 2 years before that, we established something very special, namely a NATO-Russia Council, which meets on a regular basis to discuss issues, to consult, to take joint decisions. So we have done a lot to reach out to Russia, to make Russia a part of the Euro-Atlantic security architecture. So for these reasons, I would denounce all the Russian allegations. But obviously we have never ever thought about attacking Russia or encircling Russia. And just one final remark on that, because this is a very important issue. We didn't enlarge, neither NATO nor the EU, just to make these organizations bigger. We did so because Russia's neighbors, the former communist states, wanted to become members of our Western institutions. And maybe the Russians, instead of complaining about that, should think a bit about why is it that their neighbors want so strongly to become members of NATO and the EU. It may be because they feel a bit threatened by Russia. So, all in all, their criticism is not justified. We have done a lot to make them partners, but they are adversaries. We see that now, and we must adapt to that.
Yes, ma'am, in the second row.
Do you see a risk what's happening at the moment in Europe, where we're seeing more of a right movement in a lot of, Kaczynski in various different countries at the moment, where there is more of an isolation kind of thought process that is going on there? Do you see that as a risk to the world order that you've just been describing?
Absolutely. It's a big risk. But I would add to what you just said. You see the same nationalist tendencies on the left-wing side of the political spectrum. For instance, in Greece and Spain, some of the southern European countries, you have exactly the same movements on the left side, or in the left side of the political spectrum. This is also a reason why Mr. Putin has supported some of these nationalist movements. For instance, Mr. Putin, or the Kremlin, has financed Le Pen's party in France. They have established close contacts with the nationalist parties, both in Greece on the left wing and on the right wing side, in Bulgaria, in Slovakia, and in other countries. And we do know that UKIP in Britain, which worked in favor of Brexit, that Alternative für Deutschland, which is a German right-wing party, etc. All these parties have occasionally expressed sympathetic views on Russia and on Putin and his leadership skills. I have noted exactly the same in this country. I think these movements are very dangerous for the world order that was established by President Truman, because the aim of all these political forces is to challenge the American-led world order. And you shouldn't make any mistakes. This is also behind Mr. Putin's whole behavior. He wants to restore Russian greatness in the former Soviet territory. And when he launched a reckless military operation in Syria, it was not only because he wanted to protect Assad, but it was also to demonstrate to the Americans, you cannot handle all this without Russian consent. So it's clear to me that Russia tries to challenge the world order that was established after the Second World War, and which has generated an unprecedented era of peace and prosperity. I would strongly regret if they succeed in that, and this is exactly the reason why I suggest to create this alliance for democracy. Because while democracies, of course, have very different views on many things, they basically agree on this issue, to have a rules-based world order. We call it the liberal democratic world order, a rules-based world order. We should do what we can to uphold that.
Next question, yes, sir, in the halfway back.
Wondering if your Nordic neighbors, Sweden and Finland, are ever going to link arms and make the decision to join NATO, and is Russian aggression pushing them closer to that decision?
That's an interesting question, and no doubt that the Russian aggression is pushing both Finland and Sweden in the direction of NATO. Well, it remains to be seen whether they will take the final step. But already now, it's clear that Mr. Putin's aggressive behavior has moved both Finland and Sweden closer to NATO. Both countries do what they can to fulfill the military standards that they must fulfill to eventually join NATO. Also politically, they had demonstrated their both capability and willingness to participate. For instance, Sweden participated actively in our Libya operation. And it's very interesting. I met with the Swedish Foreign Policy Committee the day before they had a vote on that. And the Swedish Social Democrats are traditionally very critical about NATO. But they told me, Secretary General, tomorrow we will vote in favor of Sweden joining the NATO operation in Libya because it is NATO, they told me. Because within NATO, we have a standing command structure, we can participate in that, and first and foremost, you have a political council that will monitor politically and control politically the whole operation. So they have come a long way in the direction of joining NATO. But I also know the political environment in both countries is such that they are very, very careful, and in particular the Finns are very careful not to provoke the big neighbor. And I'm sure that the two countries will follow each other. The one will not join NATO without the other. So I think Finland will be the interesting example. Here now, I don't think they will apply for membership, but they will move so close to NATO that we could allow them membership overnight if needed. Mr. Putin knows that. So I also think there is a deterrent effect of that knowledge. So he will not openly attack the two countries. But for instance, the Swedes have on several occasions hunted mysterious submarines in their waters. And all that contribute to a still more favorable attitude, also according to opinion polls, in the two countries when it comes to future membership of NATO.
We have about 5 minutes remaining in time for one final question. Yes, ma'am, on the side, please. And a microphone's on its way.
I would like to ask you, given the situation between Russia and Ukraine, how dangerous is for Baltic countries?
My first answer would be, thanks to the membership of NATO, the three Baltic states will be protected. I mean, Putin knows very well that he would cross a red line if he attacked openly the three Baltic states. So I would say, thanks to their membership of NATO, they are protected. But the second part of my answer is that while an open attack against the three isn't the most imminent threat, then a hybrid warfare attack could easily be a Russian step. in particular in Estonia and Latvia, because Estonia and Latvia have Russian-speaking communities counting around 25 or maybe even 30% of the population. And according to one of Putin's doctrines, he preserves the right to intervene in other countries if it is to protect what he considers the interests of Russian-speaking communities. So he could launch a hybrid attack with small green men combined with sophisticated disinformation, exactly as we saw it in Crimea. So for that reason, NATO and the European Union have joined forces together with these nations to counter that kind of disinformation, to expand a more fair and balanced broadcast in Russian language, etc., etc. So a lot of steps have been taken to improve our capability to counter such hybrid warfare. The last part of my answer would be, still, we cannot exclude anything. In particular, if Mr. Putin wants to detract attention from Ukraine or Syria or whatever, he might open a new front. And of course, if he opened a front in the Baltic states, that would be the breaking news. So that's why NATO has significantly strengthened territorial defense. Americans and other nations now rotate on a regular basis really substantial forces to the 3 Baltic states, so that Mr. Putin knows if he attacks one of these states, he will meet not only Estonians or Latvians or Lithuanians, he will meet NATO forces. So, all in all, I think they're well protected, but just in case, we have taken additional steps as part of our deterrence.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to remind you that the Will to Lead is available for purchase and signing at the exit following this program. Please join me in thanking His Excellency Anders Fogh Rasmussen for speaking on our platform.